Hi everyone, Leah here from EurekaCrystalBeads.com with another helpful beading video for you. Before I get started, just a quick reminder to go check out the rest of our channel, and if you like what you see, hit the subscribe button and notification bell and you'll always know when we're posting new content. Okay, so what I have for you today is a bit of a throwback video. So a while back, maybe 9 or 10 months ago, when we first started really getting into filming, we did a series of videos that were stitch tutorials. And at that time, our equipment wasn't as good as it is now and our lighting wasn't as good, but now we have upgraded so much and we can really make much higher quality videos. So we wanted to start to redo some of those older stitch tutorial videos based on the upgrade in our equipment and also based on some feedback that we got. So that's what I have for you here today is the first of our little redone retro series videos, maybe we'll call them, which is Even Count Flat Peyote. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, if you're not familiar, this is definitely one of the beginner stitches that most beaders start with. And I have it shown here in a few little swatches that I will go over much more closely later. But just to give you an idea of sort of what you create if you've never done peyote before, you're not familiar with peyote. It's a very tightly woven together, almost beaded mesh. That's really, really, I think, relaxing to work on. It's very repetitive, and if you like that type of mindless repetition, this is a fantastic stitch for you. So I will go over these a bit more in a bit, but to get started, let's roll up our sleeves here. And we're going to use size 8 seed beads for the demonstration in the video. Our older video used delicas, which are actually the most ideal bead to use for something like peyote stitch, and I'll get into why, but they're a bit small, so they were a little tougher to see in the video. So we're gonna use a bead that's a little bit bigger. And this is a Toho size 8 seed bead. You could certainly use Miyuki as well. So you may notice I have one bead here that's a little bit of a different color. That is going to be our stopper bead, and that is going to be a little temporary addition to the little beaded swatch I'm doing that eventually does come off, but it does help you to get started. And it is helpful to have your stopper bead be different in some way from the rest of your beads, whether it's a different color, a different shape, a different size, a different texture, just so you don't accidentally confuse it with the rest of the beads that you're going to be utilizing and try to work it into the stitch. So I'm going to start by picking up my little stop bead here. And again, I'm just doing a little swatch similar to, the swatches that I showed you. We're just going to do a little swatch here. And we're going to bring it to the end. If this was an actual piece that we were working on, you'd want to leave a tail that's long enough that you could weave it in later after sticking a needle on it, but I'm not going to worry too much about that length at the moment. We're going to just loop back around through that little stopper bead. And this is just going to keep it in place. I could move this if I wanted to. It can move up and down, but it does have enough tension there that if I stack some beads on top, it'll keep them from coming off. So this being even count flat peyote, I do need to load on an even number of beads. And again, that even number of beads is not going to include the stop bead. I'm going to do 10 beads across. And if you've never done so before, you haven't heard the term before, you're going to want to do what's called cull your beads or culling your beads. And that just means that if you happen to notice a bead that's a little wonky, a little off, let me give you an example of one that's a little wonky, a little off. See, this one's a little bigger than the others, it's a little irregular. You're going to want to leave that bead to the side and not use it. In fact, it would actually be a really great stop bead in a future project. So we have our 10 beads on here, and before you get started, double check that amount. Always double check, because you'd hate to get a little bit of your peyote done and then find out that you actually have the wrong amount on there. Because if you're off by one bead, this won't work. Not for even count flat peyote anyway, because then you will have an odd number of beads. So this is what we have here. Our little size 8 seed beads. I also find that what can be helpful if you're first learning peyote, and if you've tried it in the past and you've struggled with it, try it with a matte colored seed bead. I find that it's easier to see than something that's very shiny or has a shiny finish on it, or is maybe transparent or is lined with another color. That just makes it a little trickier to see where to put your needle. So if you've had some trouble, try the little tips and tricks that you might pick up in this video, one of them being start with a matte colored seed bead. I also like to use matte seed beads in the video because they are oftentimes easier for you, the viewer, to see. So I like to hold my peyote with the most recent row sticking out from sort of the tops of my fingertips here. In this case, I only have the one row, but as the peyote would build lower and you'd get sort of like a peyote strip coming down, I always expose just the topmost row. So we have our 10 beads here. We're going to pick up bead 11. And you're going to skip the bead that you're coming out of, the very end there, and go back into the bead right before it, your second to the last bead, or your 9th bead. Just like that. And this way, the bead that we just picked up is going to sit on top of, or next to, the bead that we're skipping over, the 10th bead. Your 11th bead is going to sit next to your 10th bead. And this first time here, sometimes your two little beads won't want to sit together exactly right. You might have to pop them up like that with your fingertips. So it's a bit loose at the moment, but that's what you want to see. And you pull this a little tighter, and they will sit nicely right on top of each other, just like that. Okay. Now this first pass across with peyote can be the trickiest because you just have a straight line of seed beads. After that, it does get much easier because you'll always know to go into the beads that are popped up, which does make it a lot easier. It's the first row that's sort of the trickiest for people. So we're going to pick up another bead. We're going to skip over the one after the one we're coming out of. So a good way to look at it is if the bead that you're currently coming out of is bead A, you're skipping over bead B and going into bead C. I'll give you plenty of close-ups. Okay. It's going to sit right in there. Let me pull this tight and give you a nice close-up. Okay, so you can see that the bead that we just added, that popped up one right there, that's the one we just picked up. The one sitting right below it is the one that we skipped over, and then we're coming out of that next bead. So that's sort of the mantra that you want to keep in your head is pick up a bead, skip a bead, go through. So you can see where my thread is coming out. And you can see where my needle is going into. So you're essentially going into every other bead each time you pick up a new seed bead there. You want to give it a nice little tug, helps to keep things nice and tight. Now, one of the problems I do see people have when they're learning peyote, or any stitch really, is sometimes you can have some tension problems. And if your beading stitch is a little on the loose side, that can make things a little tougher to know where to put your needle if things aren't really sitting the way that or the place that they should be because they're just a little wonky. So the easiest way that you can keep your tension nice and tight with peyote is to make sure that you're always pulling your thread in the direction that it's coming out of its last bead. So for example, I see a lot of people try to tighten up their peyote and they pull up and away like this. And that's not what you want. You want to pull in the direction that it's coming out. So in this case, we're heading back towards the end with the stop bead. That's where you want to be pulling, is in that direction. That's going to keep your peyote nice and tight. So we're going to pick up another bead here. Pick up a bead, skip a bead, go through. Okay. Just think every other bead. That's it. And now we're getting to the very end. Again, we're going to ignore that little lime green stop bead there. So pick up a bead, skip a bead, go through means we're going through, in this case, the very last of our seed beads. There we go. All right, so we just completed our little row here, and we're ready to keep going. All right, so what I like to do next is now is actually the time that I like to remove that stopper bead. And you can do so simply by just pulling it right off. Remember, all we'd done was loop through it. And what I'll do is I'll take my tail and my working thread, and I will tie them in a knot. And actually at this point, if you just take your tail and your working thread and you give them a nice little tug, that will also help to tighten up these first few rows of peyote stitch. So I'm going to tie them in a square knot, right over left, left over right. That'll just help to secure my tail for the time being so we can continue. Now, as far as how many rows of peyote we have here, we actually have 3 rows of peyote. You might be asking yourself, how do we have 3 rows of peyote? We've only gone, we've loaded on our beads and then we just went back to the other side. How is that 3 rows? Well, the way that peyote is counted is diagonally. So you want to start in your lowermost corner right here and count upwards diagonally. 1, 2, 3. So we have 3 rows here. That's how peyote is counted. Now, once you've gotten beyond those first 3 rows, things get a lot easier because as you can see, we have all of these beads that are popped up. Peyote is very much like a zipper, so we have these little teeth sticking up. And now it's the teeth sticking up that we're going to be going through. So we pick up a new bead to start our new row, and all you do is go through the first popped up bead or the next popped up bead that you get to. In this case, because peyote, we zigzag back and forth. That's going to be this one just right here. There we go. That very first one. And that one we just picked up sits right into that little space that was left there. Again, give it a nice little tug, pulling in the direction towards the side you're working towards. And that's what's going to keep your peyote on the tighter side. We pick up a new bead and we go through our next popped up bead. Just like that. So you can see where our thread is coming out of and then where our needle's going. So the beads that we pick up are going to sit in the little ditches that we've created. So that's why this is sometimes called stitch in the ditch. Okay, so we pick up another one. Go. Just going in and out of those popped up beads. That's all it is. And then the bead that we picked up is going to sit right in that little ditch that we're skipping over, in those little valleys. Mountains and valleys, that's what we got here. And then our bead at the very end. Right there. Pull it through. Give it a nice little tug coming out. You can see it pulls it right down into place. Hold it, give it a little tug. Remember, heading in the direction our thread is working in, that's what's going to get this to be the tightest. And then I flip. So as far as how you hold your peyote, it's up to you whether you want to work your needle back and forth like this, or if you want to flip your work at the end of every row so your needle is always working away from you. That's actually what I prefer to do, but I think the other way is really just as easy. I don't really highly recommend one over the other, whatever feels most comfortable. So now we have 4 rows of peyote, because again, if you start at your lower bead, or actually any lower bead, because remember, as this gets longer, you just keep zigzagging up as you count. So really, any lower bead is fine. But we can count 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 rows of peyote. And right now there's nowhere else to go diagonally upwards, so that means it's 4 rows of peyote. Another way that you can count the rows of peyote is if you count the beads on the outer rows. So in this case, I have 2 beads high on this side, and I have 2 beads high on this side. Add 2 and 2 together, that's 4. We have 4 rows of peyote. So that's another way that you can think about it as well. So I'm going to start to show you this new row before I take a break to get a little bit more of this worked up. Again, you can see how we're going into the first popped up bead, heading now back towards the other side. We're always zigzagging back and forth. You can see how the new bead that we picked up, come on, focus. The new bead that we picked up is going to sit right on top of the bead that we skipped over. Okay. Get a few more in there. Okay. pull it through. And you just keep working your way to the other side. Pick up a bead, skip over the ditch, go into the mountain, if you want to think of it that way, or skip over the valley, go into the mountain. You're always stitching into the mountains. And the new beads that you pick up become the mountains for the next row when you get there. And again, I give it a nice good tug coming out of the very end. That's what's going to tighten up all the work that I just did. I flip it around because that's what I prefer to do, to then keep working back this way. Right in there. It sits it right in that little spot. Right there. And then you can see that the next bead we pick up is going to sit right in that little ditch right after where our thread's coming out of. And we just go into our next little mountain. And the bead will sit in the valley right before the mountain we went into. All right, so what I'm going to do is take a little break, and I'm going to get a little bit more of this worked up, and I'm going to show you one more cool little trick about peyote stitch. So stay tuned. Okay, so as you can see, I've worked up a bit more of my peyote stitch here. And if you're super new to bead weaving and you've never done peyote, you can see how it really does create this very nice flexible mesh. It really is a lot of fun to work up. So what I'm going to show you now is how you can actually sew this into a tube. So remember what I said before, peyote is like a zipper, so we have teeth. So the way that we know that we're at the right spot to do this is by lining up the ends and seeing if our teeth interlock. Now in this case, they don't. All of our mountains are lined up and all of our valleys are lined up. What that means is that if that happens and you see that, you have to go across one more time. So right now we have 19 rows of peyote. And I know that because I have 10 beads up one side and 9 beads up the other side. Or we could have counted starting at the bottom and you just keep going up diagonally and you would find that we have 19 beads. To do to zipper peyote into a tube, you have to make sure that you have the same number on both sides. So we would want 10 and 10. So it means I have to go back across one more time. So let me do that quickly for you here, but I wanted to show you first before I did that how you can recognize when you're not quite at the right point to zipper together. And you might be saying to yourself, well, when am I going to want to zipper this together? Well, a lot of people make really fun peyote toggle clasps where the tube that you create is the bar of your toggle clasp. So oftentimes you're using beads much smaller than this one. So this is a great technique to practice on a larger swatch to get used to it. So at this point, you're going to see that when we fold it up, our mountains and our valleys are now sitting where they would fit into each other. Okay, and that's what we want to see because they're going to interlock like a zipper. And all you do to sew them together is we're going to go back and forth through our mountains, through our little teeth coming up. Just back and forth there from one side to the other. So coming out of the little lowered bead, I'm coming out of the valley on the last row that I did. I'm going to head into the mountain or my popped up bead on the opposite side. And then I'm going to go into the mountain back on the first side. And then back into the mountain on the other side. And actually, if you can go through both mountains at once diagonally like that. That kind of cuts your work down a little bit. If you can make that happen. And you'll really see it come together when we pull it nice and tightly. So again, just back and forth, zigzagging through those popped up beads or through our little mountains. And I want to show you what it looks like while it's still a little bit loose. You can see our threads going back and forth, pulling the mountains together. And the mountains from one side are going to interlock with the valleys on the other side. Those who know me know I love my visual analogies. I give this one nice good tug and the whole thing zippers together completely seamlessly. The only reason I even know that there was a seam there is because there's one last step that you have to do to finish sewing it up. So right here at the end, we need one little stitch of thread. So we're coming out of the mountain on one side, we need to head right into the bead on the other side to give it that last stitch of thread that it needs to close up the tube. You can see that stitch right there. Let me pull that out again so you can see it again. whoop, pulls right in there. So at this point, we have that perfectly seamless tube where you can't tell at all where you sewed it together, aside from, of course, where our actual working thread is. So at this point, if this was an actual project or something, you would just weave out your thread, tying some half-hitch knots along the way, and you would be done. But yeah, that is the basics of peyote. And another thing that I did is I made up some swatches here to show you of what it looks like in different sizes and shapes of beads. So we can add my little tube here to our little swatch. But what's different about all of these is all of these beads here are peyote that is 10 beads across and 10 rows high. And you can see how vastly different they look. So this is peyote with delicas right here. And once you understand the mechanics of peyote, which again, I think is great to learn on a larger bead that's still gonna interlock pretty nicely, peyote you're gonna find is the most wonderful way to do peyote because the profile of a delica bead is a square, and squares are gonna interlock much better than a circle. And while you may look at a delica and say, how is that a square? It's got a round hole and it's a cylinder. If you truly look at the profile, you have squares there, and that's how they interlock. So delicas are the most ideal bead for peyote stitch. You can also use the Toho Eikos. We carry those as well. We carry a selection of colors in both of those. This one here does happen to be a Delica by Mayuki, but essentially they're both cylinder beads, very precise cylinder beads. Next we have a Japanese 11. This is a Toho 11. Again, you could do it certainly with a Mayuki 11. These are a little bit more rounded. You can still get them to sit nice and tightly. It takes a little bit more work with tension to get them to sit nice and tightly than something like this, but totally doable. I have here, I did it with a Mayuki 15 right here. Or actually, no, this is a Toho 15, but again, of course, you can swap them out. You can do with Mayuki or Toho. This is actually a little Toho demi bead, which is sort of like a donut. That's a Toho demi bead in a size 8. I have the little Toho 1.5 millimeter by 1.5 millimeter cubes. And I even did some peyote stitch worked up with 4 millimeter fire polish. So you can see there's a ton of options with just your basic even count flat peyote. It's a ton of fun. Depending on the size and the shape of the bead, you might have to take care with your tension a little bit more. Again, the easiest one that you can do is going to be your beads that are the most square. So something like a Delica is going to be just beautiful to work with. But as long as you have kind of control of your tension and how you should pull your thread, you can work up some beautiful pieces even with lovely fire polish. Because fire polish is a bit more round than say a Delica is, you can certainly see that there's more thread that you can see in between. I'm not sure if you can quite catch it in the video, but obviously, like I said, things that are round won't interlock together as well as things that are square, but totally possible. We have actually a lot of beautiful mixes in fire polish beads, 4 millimeter, that would make an absolutely stunning bracelet. Just you grab a mix, the colors are already worked up, it looks beautiful, and then you just do some straight up peyote and you can get an absolutely beautiful little bracelet. So that is a wrap, folks. Hopefully you got a lot out of this for your basic even count flat peyote. Stay tuned. We're going to be redoing a lot of those older videos that are these stitch tutorials in ways that are much more upgraded based on your feedback and our filming style. And I'm going to link you below to these different types of beads if you want to give it a shot and make some peyote swatches yourself. I actually think these are really great to have around because they also help to figure out your measurements and how long or how many beads you would need to, say, make an inch of something. If you made all your swatches an inch long, you'll know how many beads you would need to keep doing subsequent inches. So these are great little swatches for practice and to have around for things like that. So make sure to visit us on over at EurekaCrystalBeads.com for everything that I used in the video if you'd like. And stay tuned and we'll see you next time. Bye.